Chapter 4 Dre Foolhardy Heroics. "I'm back," Dre shouted as he placed the cart in its home in front of his parents' shop. The storefront was tidy. A sign hung above the door with a picture of red pants besides a blue dress. The red pants were a practical joke on his father, as the man truly despised brightly colored pants of any kind. The continuous grains of the stained wooden siding were broken by a sparkling clean window, a recent purchase from the newly established glassmaker in Raven. Displayed proudly behind it was a regal black suit and an elegant red dress, both placed on wooden figures that were roughly humanoid in shape. His mother liked to call them her wooden children. She dressed them up like dolls whenever she got the chance, which was quite often of late, with how quickly the displayed outfits sold. There were sounds of some commotion from within the shop. He saw a blur of blue dress and blonde hair on the inside of the window. In less than a heartbeat, his mom was out of the front door and berating him.
"Where have you been? You should have been home well over an hour ago. And your father and I were worried sick, and by the creator, are you okay?"
His mother hadn't noticed the blood that covered his arms and the front of his shirt until halfway through her tirade. She ran to Dre and held his shoulders as if bracing him from falling. She looked him up and down as he tried to reassure her. "I'm fine, Mom, I'm fine. It isn't my blood," Dre said as soothingly as he could manage. "Well, whose blood is it then?" his father asked as he quickly exited the shop and walked over to them, concern etched onto a face much more suited to smiling. "It's blood from Tillman and Gladys."
"What? Are they okay?"
"Well, they are pretty severely injured, but it seems like Noralie thinks that she can help them, and I am still not exactly sure what happened. From what I've been able to glean from Bard Adian, I think that Tillman and Gladys were attacked by Ratgor. With us trying to rush them into town and then the healer needing Adian's help, I wasn't able to get any details."
"Ratgor?"
his mother squeaked in fright. "Who's this Adian fellow? He must not be from around here. I've never heard the name before," his father questioned, his light brows scrunching together over dark eyes.
"Are they going to be okay?"
his mother managed to ask, even as her breathing became unsteady and tears began to run down her face. "How did you even run into them? Were they in town? Their property is in the opposite side of Neridni from Lady Mariva," his father asked. "Whoa, one question at a time. And before I answer anything, I need to wash up. The smell of this blood is making me nauseous," Dre pleaded with his panicking parents. They calmed slightly and took him inside while his father mumbled about another perfectly good shirt being ruined. After Adian cleaned off a bit and put on some new clothes, he told his parents everything that he could remember, including that he had visited Asia instead of returning to the shop like he was supposed to. His initial instinct had been to try and lie about it, but Dre decided that in a situation like this, only the whole truth would do. With the amount of questions he was sure to be asked, it seemed far too likely he would get caught in a lie. "So, anyways, I need to go back and fetch Adian's cart," Dre said as he concluded his tale.
"You will do no such thing. We aren't going to let you traipse about all by yourself, not when there are diseased Ratgor filling the forest."
The cart was left where the path that leads to the cottage and the main road merge. Adian didn't seem all that concerned about the Ratgor being a problem when I met him there. He implied that there were only an issue in the diseased portion of the forest near the cottage. Dre paused and looked back and forth between his parents' eyes. "I need to get that cart. I promised Adian that I would retrieve it for him while he was helping the healer to save lives. It's not dangerous. It's a chore. The two of you wouldn't want me to break a promise, would you? That's not how you raised me." Dre couldn't keep eye contact with him. He knew that his argument to maintain his honor was a weak one. After all, the only reason he was caught up in this whole mess was because he had been shirking his duties. Even still, his father chose not to point that out. Instead, he said, "Okay, if you think that is what you need to do, then do it."
"What? How could you allow such a thing? It isn't safe,"
his mother shouted. Her voice was harsh, but Dre noticed a slight tremor of fear in it. His father sighed. "It's his class day, Del. He just helped save a couple of lives. He's a man now. We have to start trusting him to make his own choices." He then turned away from his wife and towards Dre, his face stern. "Besides, he's smart enough to not get any closer to Gladys's home than is necessary. Isn't that right, Dre?" "Of course. I saw firsthand what those Ratgors could do to a person. Trust me when I say that I don't want any part of that," Dre said to reassure his parents, and it wasn't a lie. He didn't plan on letting the Ratgor touch him. A brisk westerly walk along the main road, and about 100 rationalizations later, Dre stood in front of Adian's cart. He looked back and forth between the bloody crust covering the inside of what was really just a glorified wagon and the path leading to the farmhouse. This was an opportunity that he couldn't let pass him by. It was a chance to do something meaningful, something that might even be considered slightly heroic. Sure, it might be a little risky, but some risks were worth taking if the rewards were great enough. He had been racking his brain all day to think of anything that he could do to earn a class that he could be proud of. Now, this opportunity had just fallen into his lap. It was suspiciously fortuitous. Dre had never been very religious, unless throwing the creator's name around in conversation counted. Relatively few people were. But if this opportunity somehow provided him with a good class, then he might just have to rethink his beliefs. Anyways, it didn't matter whether there were some sort of divine intervention at play or if Dre had somehow willed the situation into being himself. His response had to be the same either way. He couldn't just stop because things might get a little dangerous. That's not what a hero would do. In fact, maybe the more danger, the better. With the decision made, Dre began to pull the cart towards the farmer's cottage, and with his mind and heart racing, it felt like no time at all before he walked past a stark line in the trees. What he had been walking through so far could have only been described as a beautiful but quite average forest, vibrant and full of life, as any forest would be in the depths of spring. The same could not be said for what he was currently walking through. Forest would be a generous term to describe the tree graveyard surrounding him. Sickly green sap dripped down rotting trunks. No plant life was evident except for the occasional patches of green moss that matched the sap in color. Dre knew it wasn't plausible, but it seemed that this section of woods was darker than the healthy section. Even though there were no leaves to block out the light, where previously the late afternoon sun had lit up the woods, it now looked much more like twilight, and the darkness seemed fast approaching. He looked up and could still see the sun clearly, but it was almost like looking through a foggy haze. The sun lacked luster. It just didn't seem to hold its usual brilliance. The stark change in the forest made Dre uneasy, but still he pressed on. He wasn't going to let a few rotting trees ruin his chances at getting a good class. He continued on and tried to pretend that his breaths weren't coming any faster than usual. The lie became true when his breath caught in his throat at the weak glint of light reflecting off of bronze. Soon, the entire cottage came into view, along with a pile of instruments strewn haphazardly across the ground. He stopped and searched for signs of any immediate danger, but he couldn't see or hear anything suspicious, so he started doing what he had come there to do. He pulled the cart up to the pile of instruments and loaded them into it. He constantly kept one eye out for danger, though, as the unease of the sickly forest lay heavy on his thoughts. Before long, the cart was loaded as best he could. Dre hoped that the instruments were more durable than they looked, as only some of them were in cases. The last thing that he needed was to end up ruining a bunch of expensive instruments while he was trying to be helpful. Dre walked to the front of the cart. He grasped the handle and prepared to pull, but then hesitated. Fetching a few instruments wasn't heroic. It wouldn't mean anything. He hadn't done enough. Besides, where were the rat gore that Adian had spoken of? Had the man been honest about what had happened? Dre turned away from the cart. He looked around until he spotted a trail of blood, presumably left behind by farmers, and he followed it around the side of the cottage. His suspicions about Adian faded from his mind when he saw the bodies. There were at least 15 rat-like corpses that were closer in size to their ancestors' feline enemies than to rats themselves. Dre had never seen the creatures before, but based on every description he had ever heard, they had to be rat gore, just as Adian had claimed. The bodies lay mangled and disfigured in a cone of devastation where even the dead leaves and undergrowth had been torn away. What kind of skill could do such a thing? What class did the man actually possess? Adian never confirmed it, but he had to be an adventurer, right? As such, Dre had assumed that Adian was a bard. It was the only musical class with adventuring applications that Dre had ever heard of. Maybe he had been wrong, though. Dre had never heard of a bard with such an offensively powerful ability, one that was strong enough to blast enemies away like that. Bards were supposed to be charming, charismatic, and quick-witted. They used their silver tongue and fluid minds to find backdoor solutions to problems. They weren't supposed to be bringers of carnage. The longer Dre looked at the gory display, the more uncomfortable he became. What would he do if that many rat gore came at him? What would he do if one did? He had no skills to use, no training to rely on. The concept of just how dangerous and stupid what he was doing actually was started to prickle in his mind. The thought never fully manifested, though, as movement out of the corner of his eye distracted him. A lone rat gore could be seen flickering through the trees as it ran away from Dre. It wasn't moving fast, though. An injured rat gore left over from Adian's fight, perhaps? Dre hesitated. He could definitely take on an injured rat gore, but there was no real reason to go after the thing. Adian had said that he was going to alert the council. They were sure to hire some adventurers or a militia to clear the monsters out, so in a couple days the things would be dead anyway. Even so, Dre bent over and picked up a sturdy-looking branch. The creature's fate may already be sealed, but perhaps his wasn't. He shot like an arrow off the string towards the escaping rat gore. The creature panicked as Dre approached, but its broken hind leg hindered its pace far too much for any chance at escape. Dre's breaths were coming in excited bursts by the time he came within reach of the creature. While still running, he aimed a mighty swing to crush the rat gore's head. He missed, but his branch did still manage to clip the rat gore's one functioning hind leg. There was a soft crunching sound as a small limb snapped, and the tiny beast tumbled to the ground. With its chance of escape gone, the sickly creature, with its glowing green eyes, turned and hissed at Dre. It began pulling itself towards him, its hind legs dragging uselessly behind it. Dre took an involuntary step back before he realized what he was doing. Then he took 2 steps forward. This wounded rat couldn't hurt him. So he lifted the branch above his head and brought it down fiercely on the creature. The squelching sound of its insides exiting its body should have been the end of it. Yet somehow the creature held on to its cruel life. Its broken body was still, but its head spasmed frantically as it let out a piteous squealing sound. Dre's insides writhed at the childlike sound. He couldn't make it stop until he had brought the stick down hard 3 more times. Dre hadn't run very far or really exerted himself all that much, not when compared to dragging around a cart all day. But even still, by the time the rat gore was well and truly dead, his heart was racing. His breathing was shallow and quick. The whole experience had been much less epic than Dre had hoped slaying a monster would be like. Less epic, more sad and gross. Before he had a chance to dwell on the experience any longer, though, he noticed movement again out of the corner of his eye. This time, it was from deeper in the forest. This time, it wasn't the motion of one thing, but of many. Dre looked up and saw a small horde of rat gore racing through the trees, all headed straight for him. He screamed, and then he ran. He moved as quickly as he possibly could, but the sound of their hissing approach grew ever closer. These rat gore were uninjured, and they moved with a lithe grace at odds with their sickly appearance. Dre risked a glance backwards as he was rounding the cottage. He nearly tripped when he saw one of the creatures flying through the air at his chest. In an unconscious reaction, he whipped up the branch and managed to crush the thing's skull. His grip, however, wasn't tight enough, and the impact of the creature dislodged it from his hands. Dre didn't have time to worry about that, though. The rest of the rat gore weren't far behind. He turned and sprinted to the cart. His hands found a familiar grip on the unfamiliar handles, and he began to pull. He started slow. None of the instruments were all that heavy, but there were a lot of them. He was able to pick up speed quite quickly, but not quickly enough. The rat gore were all but nipping at his heels. He strained his body and pushed every speck of power he had into his legs, and that way he managed to stay just ahead of the rat gore for the next few heartbeats. Then he had to push himself again. It seemed as if every few steps unearthed just enough hidden potential to drive him forward the next few. It wasn't enough, though. It wasn't sustainable. He knew that soon he would reach into his hidden depths, but he would find nothing left to give, and that would be the end. The end never came, though, because out of nowhere, Dre felt his pace quicken. Each step became easier than before, and each one took him a little further than it should. His ears began to pick up the sound of a skill that his body had already taken advantage of. The melody of an up-tempo song that he had recently become familiarized with began to take shape. Far up the path, Dre could see a figure running towards him. It took some time before his eyes could confirm what he already knew. Adian's short dark hair and lanky build filled Dre with hope. In what felt like no time, the man was running beside him, the powerful notes of the violin echoing off the ominous trees that surrounded them. His body moved in lockstep with the music, in a union he had only experienced vicariously when watching the village girls dance during the festival of relinquishment. Even with the speed boost provided by Adian, the pace that was needed to stay ahead of the rat gore was exhausting. The cart bounced along the road behind him with the wheels seemingly hitting every rut and hole despite his best efforts. Dre barely had the wherewithal to notice when he finally passed into the healthy portion of the forest. He couldn't help but panic, however, when Adian came to a stop only a couple dozen paces from the line dividing life and death. Dre turned his head and shouted at Adian to keep going. When he did, he saw what had captured Adian's interest. The sight brought Dre to a staggering halt as well. The Rat-Gore weren't chasing them anymore. They were stopped, all in a line, at least 50 of the things. They stood, shoulder to shoulder on hind legs, their heads reached to the middle of Dre's thigh. Not a single whisker crossed into the healthy portion of the forest. They stared at the two men, motionless. The unearthly green glow of their beady, unblinking eyes filled Dre with dread. They stayed like that, for what felt like forever, until suddenly, and in absolute unison, they turned and ran back into the depths of the dying forest. Dre watched after the Rat-Gore until the last of them had disappeared behind sickly trunks. Then he stared some more as he leaned against the cart. His heavy breath slowly returned to normal even as his eyes desperately searched the woods, fully expecting to once again see an army of Rat-Gore surging towards him. He spared a glance for Adian and noticed that the man was also staring into the depths of the corrupted woods. His sharp facial features appeared even more severe, with his expression contorted into one of consternation. Adian mouthed something to himself that Dre couldn't quite make out, before he noticed Dre watching and turned towards him, his expression growing even more severe as he spoke, something Dre wouldn't have thought possible. "That was a rather foolish thing to do. I gave you a very explicit warning about that cottage. Thank the Creator you weren't hurt." Following his words, he made a cupping motion with his free hand and glanced up at the sky. Dre took note of the religious movements, but a true believer was not a rare enough thing to distract him from his own guilt. He could feel his cheeks redden as his eyes dropped to the dirt road. "I know it was stupid. I was just trying to help." After a few moments of silence, Dre looked up to see Adian staring at him silently, right eyebrow raised. Dre sighed. He was hoping to be able to keep things vague. "Honestly," he paused, not sure what to say. Before he could think something up, though, his nervous mouth spat out the words at the forefront of his mind. "I thought that helping you might give me better class options. Tonight is my class night, and as everything currently stands, I'm just worried that I will get assigned the common laborer class. I had hoped that doing something brave might change that." Adian's expression softened a bit. "I'm just glad that I arrived when I did. Those Rat-Gore were nearly on top of you." Dre's heart began to race again as an uncomfortable thought crossed his mind. He hurriedly surveyed the contents of the wagon and let out a sigh of relief. Although they had all been obviously jostled around, none of the instruments appeared to be damaged. Adian, who obviously followed Dre's line of thought, said, "I have a skill called musician's weapons. It greatly increases the durability of all my instruments." He pointed the suspiciously sharp tip of the violin bow at Dre. "It may have also adjusted the lethality a bit." "So the instruments actually are your weapons? And not in a bardic, poetic kind of way?" Dre questioned, a small smirk growing on his face. "Like you physically hit monsters with them?" Adian started walking back towards Nridni. Yeah, I know it sounds silly, but I'll have you know that I dispatched a feline monster with this very violin earlier today." Dre started pulling the cart as he responded. "Seriously? I heard a farmer complain about a large creature taking one of his sheep last week. Everyone assumed that it was a bear, but maybe it was like the creature you fought." Dre froze when Adian turned and skewered him with his gaze. "Is this farmer's land near the corrupted area?" "I doubt it. I haven't heard anything about this corruption, and his farmer is quite a ways north of here, and in a much more populated area. If the corruption had spread that far, then I'm sure that it would be the talk of the town. Do you know what it is? How far it spreads?" "I'm not sure what it is exactly, or how far it spreads in any direction but this one. Did you notice that the Rat-Gore seemed just as sick as the forest?" "It's the first time I've seen a Rat-Gore. Is that not how they always look? I definitely noticed how odd it was when they stopped right at the line of the corruption, though. Did they corrupt the forest? Does it mark out their territory?" Adian gave Dre an appraising look and said, "I hadn't thought of that, but I was thinking along similar lines. I noticed the Rat-Gore stop before entering the normal forest when I escaped from them last time. I think that might mean that whatever is causing the corruption might actually be controlling them. But that couldn't be true if an infected cat has been hunting outside of the corruption in farmers' fields." "Well, maybe the farmer saw the cat monster before it was corrupted. Or maybe it is an intelligence thing. Maybe a cat can be trusted to follow orders without direct control. I would assume that Rat-Gore are not generally known for their intelligence." "That would make sense, actually. We don't have enough information to say anything definitively at this point, but I'll bring it up when I address the village council. Assuming there is some sort of village council? Yes, there is. My father, Taylor Sherman, is actually a member, Dre said, unable to keep a hint of pride from entering his voice. Healer Norley is as well. I will need to talk with them immediately. I think this threat should be addressed as soon as possible, and people need to know not to enter these woods. The silence stretched as they continued to walk. Just as Dre's mind was once again drifting towards his class selection, Adian spoke. Why didn't you just leave the cart? You probably could have outpaced them without my help if you had just left it behind. Dre thought for a while before he responded. It's a lot less heroic if I leave the cart. Besides, it's barely slowed me down. I'm stronger than I am fast. Leaving the cart might have made me faster, but I would have failed, which seemed unacceptable at the time. Thinking about it now, though, what good is improving my class selection options if I don't live long enough to make the choice? Adian smiled. The more life we have left, the more urgent things seem. That's what my father always says. Learn from your mistakes, Dre. You have a second chance. I've known men who weren't so lucky. Dre dropped his head before he whispered, Thank you for coming for me, for giving me that second chance. But why did you even think to come? The healer gave me the location of your home once my assistant was no longer needed with Farmer Tillman and his wife. They are on the way to recovering, by the way, Adian said. Why did you want to check in on me? Dre asked. Adian spoke after a slight hesitation. A few reasons. I wanted to make sure you were actually okay. Like I mentioned before, seeing such injuries can be traumatizing to people. Besides that, I was planning on getting my cart from you. I had assumed you had just brought it back to your house instead of the healer's. I was actually thinking about asking for your help in retrieving my instruments. Adian smirked and continued, which you already did. So take this. I was going to use it to tempt you into helping me. Adian pulled a silver coin out of a coin pouch that bulged a lot more than Dre would have suspected from an adventuring musician. He flipped it with his thumb high into the air. Dre released the cart with one hand and snatched it. Dre stared down at the silver coin and then looked up at Adian. His parents paid him a copper coin a week. He hesitated, but eventually decided to ask a question that had been floating around his mind since he had first heard about the man. Well, I know I haven't made the best first impression, but would you maybe want to work together in the future? I heard a rumor that you were trying to form an adventuring party and, well... Dre immediately regretted the question. Real smart. Trying to join the guy that had just had to save his butt because he refused to heed his warnings. Maybe he would have thought about it before this little misadventure, but there was no way that Adian would want to work with him now. Besides, it was obvious. Dre's negative thought spiral was cut short by Adian, who was smirking knowingly. Let's talk after tonight. If you get a class that could fit into my adventuring party, then I'd be glad to have you.